e-conference. My name is Hannah Shea, and I am the Manager for Communications and Network Development with World Law Group. Everyone, with the exception of our panelists, will be muted for the duration of the presentation, and we ask that if you have questions, you put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If you do have the same question as another attendee, please upvote that outstanding question. We will try to address questions as they present themselves, and if not, we will get to them at the end. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will address them in a recap of the presentation. If you experience technical difficulties, you can note your problem in the chat area and we will try to assist you. At the end of the presentation, there will be an option to complete a quick survey. Please take 1 minute to complete this. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the conference website so that you can refer back and share with your colleagues. For those of you who are new to or unfamiliar with World Law Group, we are a leading network of independent law firms across the globe with 59 member firms, more than 18,000 lawyers in our network across 89 countries, and in more than 400 offices. We collaborate globally in our 15 practice and industry groups, as well as our forums, programs, and committees. And in 2019, we shared more than 2,600 referrals among our member firms. Our members are deeply established and respected firms in their markets, with in-depth knowledge of the local business community, customs, and culture. For more information on the World Law Group, please visit our website. With that, I will now hand it over to our moderator, Andrew, to begin the panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Ang, and I am from Wong Partnership, the Singapore member of the World Law Group. Thank you for taking the time to join us in this Asia regional meeting as part of WLG's 2020 Fall E-Conference. It is unfortunate that we are still not able to do this in person, but this has at least given us the opportunity to see more new participants. So for those who are joining a WLG event for the first time, a very big welcome to you. Today's topic, lessons from COVID-19 in Asia through the lens of sustainability and ESG. And I'm very glad we have two experts to guide us through this discussion. First, we will have Janet Pahima, whom most of you know. Janet is a partner from Herzog, Fox and Neeman, the WLG member firm from Israel. And she leads HFN's Impact Investment and Socially Responsible Investment Department. This department offers a full legal ecosystem for clients operating in the field of creating social value, and they advise startups, social entrepreneurs, creating products and services to make a positive impact on a host of local and global issues. They also advise investment funds whose investors are no longer content with just financial results. And they also advise corporations engaged in solving some of the world's greatest challenges. I am especially grateful to Janet because this is about 8 a.m. in Israel at the moment. I'm also very grateful to have our second speaker from over at the other end of the globe, Sarah Barker. Sarah is from MinterEllison, the WLG firm from Australia, and she leads Minter's International Climate Risk Governance and Sustainability team. In that role, Sarah helps corporations, institutional investors, and government agencies to manage dynamic environmental, social, and governance risks through a commercial lens. Sarah has particular expertise in the climate change related exposures under corporate and securities laws, including directors' fiduciary duties and financial reporting disclosure obligations. Now, before we turn to our experts, a little bit of background on the topic. Now, this is a letter from BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink. Now, every year, Larry Fink releases a highly anticipated letter to CEOs and clients. In this year's letter, Larry Fink announced that his firm would make investment decisions with environmental sustainability as a core goal. BlackRock, as you may know, is the world's largest assets manager with nearly 7 trillion in investments. And this move will fundamentally shift its investment policy and could also reshape how corporate America does business and potentially puts pressure on perhaps other large money managers to follow suit. Mr. Fink's annual letter to the CEOs of the world's largest companies is often closely watched. He said BlackRock would begin to exit certain investments that present a high sustainability-related risk, with the intent of encouraging every company, not just energy firms, to rethink their carbon footprints. Mr. Fink also pledges to make board members accountable. Now, when you consider that just last year, BlackRock voted against every single resolution backed by the Climate Action 100+ Investor Coalition, the very same group that BlackRock now just committed to join, one cannot help but think that someone is finally taking ESG issues seriously. Second slide here on Global Sustainable Fund's second quarter 2020 statistics. As you can see, Asian countries only accounted for 2.4% of global inflows into ESG funds and recorded net outflows of 894 million during the second quarter this year. So Asia region bucked the global trend, which saw inflows of 71.1 billion, up 72% compared with the first 3 months of the year. Worldwide inflows into sustainable funds rose sharply in the second quarter, but APAC investors still remain unconvinced. So as you can tell, Asia clearly is still an ESG laggard. As you can see from this slide showing the results of a JP Morgan survey, that most investors have a rather positive view of the impact of COVID-19 on the ESG investment momentum in the coming 3 years. Why? So from an environment standpoint, the COVID-19 enforced work from home culture is likely to continue. This means that more people will continue to abandon their daily car commute routine. On the social front, the crisis has magnified and increased inequality between those who have access to efficient healthcare system and those who have not, between children who can access online education and those who cannot, between those who have the ability to work from home, like you and I, and those who have not. So on average, 64% of the population in emerging markets works in the informal economy. So for all these people, work from home simply means no income. As for G, governance, COVID-19 has shown the value of good governance. Companies with the best governance have fared better thus far. Those with the defensive capital allocation strategies were shown to be more resilient, particularly against the sudden loss of income. It is therefore clear, at least to me, that ESG is not something that is vague and distant, but something that immediately strengthens the resilience of our societies and companies. Now, this slide is taken from a report by the CFA Institute with data taken from Asia Pacific signatories to the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment reporting framework in 2017. So as you can see, even before COVID-19, the respondents in the APAC region predicted a considerable increase in the impact of ESG issues on prices and yields by 2022. So as lawyers, particularly in Asia, how does all this impact us? Do we understand the coming expectations around ESG? How can we be ready? So with that, I will now let someone who actually knows what they're talking about ESG to share her experience. Janet, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And that was pretty impressive for someone who thinks they didn't know what they were talking about. So welcome to the world of people who do know the topic and do enjoy talking about it. Right, now we're going to look a little bit of what's going on. And I want to back up a second, and I want to start with a couple of quotes. First, let's start with an inspirational quote from Margaret Mead. Let's go back to anthropology and remember that she said, that no doubt, never doubt, that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. A lot of practitioners look at ESG and the small group that started to push it early on and say, this is exactly what's happening. People are committed, people are small, and it is slowly taking over a lens of the world. The next quote is from JP Morgan, and the most important part about it is the fact that it's from players as large in our industry, in the financial world, as JP Morgan. And that's basically saying that these pandemics and environmental risks and putting them together, which is why we're looking at COVID-19 now through the lens of ESG, are the same kind of wake-up call to the world economy, that these things have to be taken into consideration. And they're very difficult to build into a financial model. I want to go back a step first in the next slide and talk about a little bit about where this started. Before we get to ESG, we had a concept of socially responsible investing, SRI. And that's just a very big term for all sorts of investment strategies that talk about using capital for social needs and not just for economic needs. You're allocating capital on social basis alongside financial returns. And there's always a balance to not neglect the financial returns when we're talking about socially responsible investment. We are not talking about philanthropy. So there are a lot of different approaches that you can hear about. Impact investing is one that we talk about a lot. Ethical investing is one we talk about a lot. And then ESG investing is another type of SRI. And some definitions to just pay attention to. And there are many different definitions, but I would just want to throw that out so we all know what we're talking about. When we say ESG, and we know we're talking about environmental social governance, that's a term saying in capital markets, are we looking at behavior, corporate behavior, to determine the future financial performance alongside the factors they're going to be in these three different areas? They're non-financial performance indicators within the general world, looked at sustainability, ethics, corporate governance issues, carbon footprint, which we always hear about. How do we manage our carbon, how do we reduce our carbon footprint? And how do we make sure that we have overall accountability and sustainability in our companies? Now, a little bit of basics in the world. And again, you'll find many different definitions, many different lists. I think this list is helpful to give you an idea. If we just sort of roll through, I'll read them out just in case your screens are very small when you look at this. But environmental, the basic focus, and again, this is not an inclusive, this is just a suggestive list. There are other things too. Waste and pollution, resource depletion, greenhouse gas emission, deforestation, climate change, which we'll hear so much more about from Sarah. Then we have the social side. Well, what does that mean? How does a company treat its people? And that will look at employment policies, diversity, working conditions, things like child labor and slavery, which obviously when we're in many of our countries, we don't realize is relevant, and yet it is in the international global supply chain. What is the interaction with local communities, health and safety, conflict within the society? And then let's get to governance, which is how a company polices itself and operates itself and manages itself. So let's look at their tax strategy. And tax strategy is interesting, as that means if a company is able to pay no tax, is that really corporate governance on a sustainable global level? Probably not. Executive remuneration, how much are people paid? How much are they paid compared to the rest of the employees? It's when you start hearing about ridiculous bonuses being paid to companies that got bailouts during a financial crisis. Is that appropriate corporate governance? Donations, political lobbying, how is that used between that and corruption and bribery? And there is, what's the connection between the two of those? And also on the board, is there diversity? What's the structure of the board? And those kind of issues, okay? So anyway, so there we were in corporate social responsibility. Now, what is corporate social responsibility? Again, let's give you some more definitions, okay? Corporate social responsibility is when a company tries to do something positive for its employees and the environment and consumers, And it's self-regulated. And a lot of companies talk about their CSR policy. It can be the donations they give to the community. It could be the day that they go out and do good deeds and paint the walls of a animal shelter or a homeless shelter. All these things are CSR. They're not core though. They're not core, they're not really measurable. ESG goes way further and it says, let's look at metrics. Let's see how many kilowatts have you actually saved of energy? What have you actually done with your carbon footprint? What have you done with your water conservation? Set targets and try to meet them. That's the reporting we want to see on ESG. I think it's important to note that because so many people talk about these things without actually realizing that there's a lot more behind it than just saying, okay, we follow ESG and we're good for ESG. Now, in terms of global trends, I'm going to give you, and promise you I won't read this, a lot of different organizations that are now following ESG, monitoring and tracking. The reason why this is important is you're going to see some very big names. You're going to see S&P Global that has an ESG evaluation where they're monitoring companies. They have a risk atlas to look at companies on ESG exposure, where Morgan Stanley is in the game. Global Reporting Initiative, if we stop on that one for a second, I think that's going to be the next slide. Global Reporting Initiative, which is GRI, is probably, if we go to the next slide and we'll see it, GRI is probably the biggest name today in international organizations that are doing work on ESG and monitoring ESG. They work with over 90 countries. The point of GRI is to have some kind of standardization in the definitions we're talking about, the metrics that we're looking at, how we can measure these things. And finally, another interesting one is SASB, which is Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards. This is an attempt to make things as equal across the board and reportable across the board as financial standards, as the financial standards, the accounting boards that set up all the different standards that companies can all follow and have to follow. And finally, the last one on the list is from the United Nations, which again is interesting that the Global Compact, which was done back in 2000, is also trying to encourage businesses to look at environmentally and socially friendly policies. We're talking 20 years ago this happened. Now they're estimating 12,000 companies in 160 countries have signed on to this UN pact. I want to talk about Israel for a second, because if Andrew invited me here, I might as well throw that in. We do not have specific disclosure regulations. Reporting for public companies does include many of the issues that are covered under ESG. Everything that's relevant and material, everything material to a company must be reported. We tend to over-report, so a lot of these issues will come up. But we do see in Israel, following the rest of the world, investors are becoming increasingly sensitive to these issues. The Israel Securities Authority right now is in the middle of analyzing public comments that it received after a request for commenting on ESG and whether ESG should be mandatory, voluntary, to what companies should it apply in the Israeli market. They said the response they received was more than they've ever received before for requests for public comment. The interest was incredible, and that says a lot. We also have a group that does a CSR and ESG rating. They started with CSR, they've added ESG, and they're rating now more than 150 companies, mostly public companies in Israel. I don't know how many of you have heard of the phenomenon of the startup nation, but it's basically based on a book that talks about why Israel was able to create so many successful startups when it's such a small country. Well, as a result of that, a nonprofit was formed called Startup Nation Central, which tries to highlight all the startups in Israel and have them accessible to anyone in the world. They have something called the Finder, which is a database, which is free. You don't have to be a member. You can go in and find information about any startup in Israel. A lot of the information comes from the startups. If the startups don't give the information, they'll find it themselves. It's a huge resource. They have now done a project to add a filter for SDGs. SDGs are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The idea is these are 17 goals to be achieved by 2030, really to make the world a better place in every single aspect. How is that connected to ESG? It's the same principles. The things that will create positive ESG are things that are also going to help with the SDGs, meeting our global goals. We have one more thing I want to mention, which is social impact bonds. We have some of these in Israel, not very many, but the areas they've done have been particularly interesting. A social impact bond basically means an investor will pay for a project in a classic sense. And I know in Australia, it's actually done very differently, but in a classic sense, an investor will pay for a project. The project sounds good. It should something that the government should be doing or a school should be doing, but they can't afford it until they make sure that it works. So the investor pays, somebody does a great project, let's say with a government institution. And then if it works, the investors get their money back plus a return. If it doesn't work, the government doesn't pay for the project. If it works, the government can then take over the project because they know it's a good idea and do it themselves. So it can be seeds to do very scalable projects by governments later on or other institutions. So we have some very groundbreaking areas going on right now, like pre-diabetes projects to prevent diabetes and alleviating the problem of loneliness with senior citizens. Now we're going to add in COVID-19 to this whole mess of things that are going on. And that gave us our short-term challenges, right? Like all of us, remote working. How many of us in the room here did not do remote working at some point? Greater flexibility is needed. We have closures of schools. We have parents who have to deal with their children doing online learning. There's different shifts for school children. Everything is so unknown. As a result, some companies found increased productivity during this time, or at least productivity was even. Example, commuting time. If you have a commute of 2 hours a day, you just gained another 2 hours, and a lot of people's commute are even longer than that. So employees could be more productive. They could have more balance. They could have less stress in trying to get everything done in their balance. There were cost savings. People have to think about in the long term, do we need as much space as we used to have? Should we reconsider how we configure our offices? How much face time do we need? Do we really need all those business trips? Business trips are very, very expensive. And they were just considered the way that we do business as getting on a plane, getting in a car, going to see people. Do we need to do that as much even when things return back to normal? There are studies that say that companies with strong ESG policies outperform those without. On the other hand, it may depend on sectors. High tech clearly did better than companies focused on energy. So whether the ESG friendly companies did better or not is a little bit of an open question. If we dissect this virus for a minute, what we have is our first sustainability crisis of the 21st century. COVID-19 impacted every sector and every country, and that's amazing. Nothing else has done that. Clearly, in our lifetimes, or going back maybe forever in the history of the globe. Nobody thought about pandemics when they were doing risk factors. You don't see that in a prospectus. But if they had, how could it have helped? What could be done in a situation like that? Nothing, right? I mean, how do you risk in the fact that if there's a pandemic, we may have to close our business? It wouldn't create a discount on the value of a company. So what happened? Now let's again do our dissection. Let's look at the S in COVID-19. Okay, what happened in the social thing? Companies had to, first of all, keep their employees safe. They had to figure out how to deal with illness from employees, illness of family members, employees that had to be caregivers. How do they deal with them remotely? How do they deal with employees' mental health? All these are social issues. In companies that don't look at those issues with employees can have very dramatic effects on their workforce. In the longer term, maybe there'll be more remote learning, maybe remote working, maybe there'll be more, maybe there'll be a smaller workforce. A lot of people let go a lot of employees. They may have realized that that was okay and they didn't need to do that. And of course, they have to think about whether travel is worth the risk and the cost. Let's get to the G. if a company was done with good transparency and robust corporate policies, it was able to quickly change what it had to do, gather support behind it, and be effective. Investors are also asking, what are you doing to protect your company in the case of another pandemic or crisis? What about suppliers? What about their communities? How did you deal with them? And then finally, the big E being environmental, and that's climate change, and how does that affect our risk to people and planet that we have? So the World Health Organization is estimating that there could be hundreds of thousands of unnecessary fatalities every year based on issues that are coming out of climate change, not to mention the actual disasters that we might have, which are when you have an extreme weather change, flood, or diseases. And now I'm going to give you some statistics, and Andrew gave you some already. The fun in statistics is that no matter how many statistics you see, they're never the same. And there's a reason, because we're all using different definitions. So companies that as we say, claim to follow ESG are something like 44% of global assets under management, right? That's where we get a number like 45 trillion. So are we really going to say that 45 trillion assets are invested in ESG? That's very misleading. But if you look at ESG dedicated funds, where they're saying we're only investing in companies with a very high ESG rating, that gets to about $1 trillion. Now that may only be 2% of assets under management globally, but it's a very large amount of money in our terms. Andrew had a very pretty graphic slide for those of you that missed it from JP Morgan in a survey. And the important part, if you aggregate some of those blocks, you see that more than 70% of investors are really likely to think that there is a good probability that something which may be a low probability, but a high impact risk, like a pandemic, is going to increase awareness and need to take action, including regarding climate change. So we have something we see maybe a low probability, but the risk is so high, the impact is so high that it needs to already be considered. The Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a UN project, PRI, found in 2006, found again, more than about 65% of respondents said that COVID-19 really brought all this onto their radar in a way that they never did before, including on how you handle employees and supply chains and your purchasing and diversity and everything else, even privacy. I want to end with a quote by JP Morgan, and I'm glad that the word laggard was already used by Andrew, because I thought that was a little harsh. But JP Morgan saying that Asia has long been a laggard in ESG investing, but the movement's now spreading. ESG disclosure regulations are being adopted or discussed in multiple jurisdictions, Japan being ahead of the game, Japan being the first out, and their Japanese government pension investment fund already signing the Principles for Responsible Investment. That's what I said, that UN PRI back in 2015. So I leave you with that quote. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. It is my turn to take the tag team. My name is Sarah Barker. I head the Climate Risk Governance team at MinterEllison. MinterEllison being the largest independent commercial law firm in the Asia Pacific. And what I wanted to talk to you about today, following on from Janet's discussion of the development of ESG and its impact in investment markets in particular, is to really focus on how climate change has changed in its relevance for commercial law practices over the last 5 or 6 years. So I'm a corporate lawyer. I've been a corporate lawyer for more than 20 years. And when I shifted my practice from being a securities disclosure focus to being climate and sustainability risk governance, this was how climate change was positioned within a commercial law firm, consistent with the positioning that Janet talked about historically, it was considered to be an environmental, ethical, non-financial issue, and certainly not the kind of issue that a commercial law firm in a mergers and acquisitions practice, for example, or a corporate governance practice should be concerned with. At its highest, it was an issue that was considered within an environment and planning practice, perhaps a tax practice if you're in a jurisdiction that had a carbon tax, or for your commercial clients, an issue perhaps around customer relations, public relations, corporate social responsibility. Fast forward to 2020 though, we understand that climate change is a material financial risk and a material legal risk issue for the vast majority of our corporate clients. So now we understand that it has significant ramifications across areas like corporate governance and directors' duties, securities fraud and misleading disclosure, human rights, particularly claims against government, mergers and acquisitions in terms of the level of due diligence in climate-related financial risk exposures, and correspondingly the warranties that we want to build in to contracts on behalf of our clients, in project and corporate finance, in fund structuring, insurance, compliance with prudential and capital regulatory requirements, and the list goes on. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is what has changed for us as commercial lawyers in relation to climate change, and what is also potentially over the horizon in Asia. And to do that, I'm going to talk in the rule of threes. I'm going to talk to you about 4 different issues and apply 3 different examples in each case. First of all, why is climate change a financial risk issue? And there we're going to look at the 3 kinds of financial risk that the Bank of England uses when it talks about climate change and its impact on financial stability in the UK. I'm then going to look at, well, what has changed in the last 12 to 18 months, because it really is the last 12 to 18 months where we've seen an acceleration in both the financial and legal environment in which climate change is relevant to our clients. And there I'm going to look at 3 kinds of ratchet: the regulatory ratchet, the investor pressure ratchet, and the litigation ratchet. Then I'll look at potential forthcoming developments in Asia by reference to 3 key jurisdictions. And then finally, give you 3 key questions, leave you with 3 key questions about, well, what does this mean for commercial practice more broadly? What does it mean for your practice? So to start with, why is climate change a foreseeable and in fact usually material financial risk and opportunity for the vast majority of commercial clients? And as I say, I look to the framework that was first articulated by the Bank of England Prudential Regulation Authority back in 2015, where it broke down climate change into 3 kinds of financial risk. First of all, the physical risks, so the impacts of climate change, whether they're gradual onset issues like sea level rise or increasing average temperatures, or extreme catastrophic risks like increases in drought, bushfire, inland flooding. Those impacts on both the natural environment and the built environment have financial consequences. But secondly, they articulated a new category that we weren't really used to thinking about in conjunction with climate change, which they called economic transition risks. So these are not the environmental impacts of climate change per se, but the responses of markets to those risks. So the responses of government, the responses of capital markets, the responses of the real economy, technological developments, shift in stakeholder preferences associated with the threats of climate change. And then finally, the liability risks associated with climate change, and not just in liability risks associated with corporate emissions per se, but liability risks associated with corporate failures to manage or disclose the financial risks imposed upon the business and its profitability associated with climate change. And I should say, for full disclosure, I contributed that liability chapter to the Bank of England's report. So as clearly a financial risk that arises not only over longer term investment horizons, but certainly short and medium term investment horizons, it means that climate change provokes the same response of the commercial law as any other financial risk or opportunity. And as corporate lawyers, that particularly includes the duties of directors to exercise due care and diligence in pursuing the best financial interests of a corporation. I am a shareholder primacist, I should put that out there. None of this stakeholder malarkey. And secondly, in relation to disclosure of the true and fair view of a company's financial position, its performance and prospects. So what's changed in the last 12 to 18 months? Why is this suddenly becoming such a huge issue? Well, starting with the regulatory ratchet. In the last 12 to 18 months, we have seen an explosion in both national and subnational governments not only announce aspirational targets to decarbonise their economies before 2050, but laws codifying that target to decarbonise their economies before 2050. Well, why is that? Why this sudden flurry? Well, we can trace that back to the Paris Agreement, which is an agreement that was reached in Paris, funny that, amongst 196 countries around the world back in December of 2015. And under that agreement, these countries all committed to introducing policies in their own jurisdiction, in their own unique context, that would be consistent with limiting global warming caused by climate change to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial averages, and to pursue endeavours to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. What then happened in December of 2018 was the United Nations published a report that said, well, if we're actually going to limit global warming to the levels agreed under the Paris Agreement, we've left our run so late that we now need to decarbonise the entire global economy before 2050. So now we're seeing this flurry of commitments by governments to give force to that recognition that in order to comply with Paris Agreement targets, the entire global economy will need to decarbonise over the next few decades. It's not only economies like the UK, the EU and large subnational economies like California and New York that are making these commitments. Increasingly, we are seeing Asian jurisdictions follow suit. So, of course, we've had South Korea's Green New Deal. In the last week, we've had the new Japanese Prime Minister Suga announce a policy platform in his maiden speech to also introduce a net zero by 2050 law in Japan. And within the last month, we had China announce at the United Nations that it is implementing its own net zero target, albeit by 2060 rather than 2050. In addition to these net zero laws, for our commercial clients, we're also seeing associated developments emerge across other forms of policy adjacency. So in areas like trade, with the European Union flagging the potential to impose carbon border tariffs on imports coming in from countries that do not share the same decarbonisation ambition as they do in that bloc. And interestingly, Joe Biden has a similar policy as part of his own election platform pending the US election next week. We're also seeing these targets starting to translate across into prudential regulation. And again, in the EU, the Commission has flagged that it is looking at changes to the capital regulatory requirements that apply to banks, pension funds and insurance companies operating in the EU, so that there would be a look through onto their balance sheets and adjustment of their capital requirements depending on whether their asset holdings were green or brown. So we've seen significant movement in the last 12 to 18 months on a policy and regulatory front. This is being reflected in increases in investor expectations, and this is well and truly despite COVID. In fact, if anything, we've seen a significant acceleration and raising of the bar by investors in terms of the specificity of expectations on investee companies. And Andrew, of course, mentioned BlackRock's commitment in January to embed sustainability into the heart of its investment strategy. That's being reflected in the proxy filings that we saw in the first half of the year in the Northern Hemisphere and are seeing here in Australia in the second half of the year with our 30 June corporate year end. So we're seeing an increase in the number and mainstream support for proxy resolutions seeking corporate commitments to net zero targets, net zero emissions targets, and not only the longer term targets themselves, but also seeking a disclosure and transparency around the short and medium term initiatives that will be implemented in pursuit of that target. So shorter term, medium term and longer term targets. Also seeing increased pressure on Scope 3 emissions targets. What's Scope 3 emissions? This is basically the emissions that occur outside the fence lines of a particular business. So if, for example, you are a miner of thermal coal, it would be a Scope 3 emission where that coal is burned by one of your utility customers. So outside your business fence lines, but directly associated with your product. Also seeing increased pressure around corporate lobbying, where investors are seeing a disconnect between the messaging direct from corporations on the need to decarbonise and the interference being run by a number of industry bodies on tightening greenhouse gas emissions laws and targets, and also seeking to align executive and board remuneration with the achievement of those carbon targets. We saw this on both sides of the Atlantic. For example, huge banks like JP Morgan and Barclays were both subject of shareholder resolutions seeking their agreement to net zero targets. Barclays was eventually supported by management and passed with more than 99% approval. JP Morgan, it was opposed by the board and yet still attracted 49.7% support amongst its shareholders. And that has now started to translate over to Asia as well. You may have seen towards the middle of the year, Mizuho, one of the largest bank funders of fossil fuel assets, had a proxy resolution filed seeking it to disclose its plan to transition to net zero emissions and to cease financing of coal-related assets, and that attracted more than 35% in an example that was the first such proxy resolution filed in Japan. The last ratchet is in relation to litigation, and particularly around duties and disclosure. So one of the cases that's thrown a few cats amongst the pigeons in investment markets in particular is a filing that occurred in the federal court here in Australia in late July in a claim by a retail purchaser of exchange-traded sovereign bonds who alleged that the Australian Commonwealth Government had breached requirements around misleading disclosure in the issue of prospectuses in its failure to disclose the impact of climate-related financial risks on both the Commonwealth's financial position and prospects, and those specifically of the bond, the creditworthiness of the bond. In addition, the claim also alleges that the officers in charge of the Commonwealth Treasury and the CEO of the Australian Office of Financial Management, who issued the bond, had also breached their statutory duties of due care and diligence in allowing the Commonwealth to publish a prospectus that was alleged to have been misleading due to the failure to articulate these risks. Now, what is interesting is this was not a claim in relation to a green bond, a claim that a bond had been labelled as green when in reality it wasn't. This was a claim in relation to a vanilla sovereign bond issue and reflects quite squarely the mainstream market recognition of the fact that climate change is now a material financial risk and opportunity, and as such needs to be interrogated, verified and disclosed in the same way as any other financial risk issue when you are looking at debt or equity information memoranda. So over the horizon to Asia, what can we see, or what can I foreshadow that we may see in Asia? One of the significant developments in jurisdictions that do not have either carbon taxes or historically have not had quite ambitious emissions reduction strategies has been the use of the corporate law as a mechanism to shift market behaviour. And so what we've seen is the proliferation of influential legal opinions where very, very respected and eminent jurists, ex-jurists and barristers have opined on the fact that climate change has evolved to be a material financial risk, and that therefore enlivens positive obligations of directors to both have regard to that risk, to exercise due care and diligence, and to disclose material impacts on financial performance, position and prospects in the same way as any other financial risk. That was a first such opinion was published in Australia in 2016 by noted senior counsel Noel Hutley, who is actually the former chair of the Australasian Bar Association. Mr. Hutley's opinion was then subsequently picked up by our Reserve Bank, by our prudential regulator, by our securities regulator, and by our Accounting and Auditing Standards Board, and specifically cited as one of the reasons for their changing of their own enforcement position around climate change as a material financial risk for commercial corporations. We've had similar opinions published in the UK by Deverbois and Plimpton, in New Zealand by Chapman Tripp, and recently in Canada, the Hansel opinion. And this is where I can foreshadow that similar opinions are forthcoming in a number of Asian jurisdictions, all of which are being briefed by the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative. So in Singapore, we have a forthcoming opinion from Jeffrey Chan, in Hong Kong by Andrew Stock, and currently briefing in India, Japan and Korea. So to close, what issues does this raise for a commercial law practice, and what are some of the questions that you can each take back to your own practices and interrogate the preparedness of the practice to be advising on these issues to your clients? First question, does your practice consider climate change through a financial risk lens as well as an environmental risk lens when you are looking at the legal consequences of this issue? Are you taking advantage of the opportunities in this space? Which areas of our practice can we integrate climate-related risk issues in providing a sophisticated level of advice for our clients and differentiate ourselves from other firms? Flip side of opportunity is always risk. This is a highly specialist area, and so what specialist expertise do you need to bring in to protect your client's interest? Whether it's specialist due diligence expertise in an M&A or listing context, green finance expertise, or misleading disclosure advisory. So that's all from me. We'll get Janet back on the line as well, and we would be more than happy to take any questions that any of the participants have. And I think, Andrew, you're going to moderate those for us.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Janet. Very illuminating indeed, especially for me. Just looking at the Q&A, I think you both did a great job because no one seems to have any Q&A. But maybe I'll just have one for each of you. Janet, you introduced, a multiple of ESG frameworks and regimes. What, in your view, is emerging as a standard? What are your clients aligning with? What do you see in the future? Perhaps a little bit of crystal ball gazing. Would there be one standard that is going forward?
I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that everyone's trying to create their own standards, and standardization is very difficult. So a lot of people in the field, and especially I know this is also coming from the GSG, the Global Steering Group on Impact Investment, which was started, that's when you talk about the G8 on impact investment, the Global Task Force, that was the predecessor. So spearheaded by Sir Ronald Cohen, began all the big conversation globally on these issues. I think they're leaning more toward the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative for Standardization. There's an organization called the GIN, the Global Impact Investment Network, and they have standards, the IRIS, and that's working together with GRI. Those are the ones that are the most known in the area. But the problem is that everyone looks on their own. Companies and countries come up with their own standards. It makes it very, very hard to compare. And if you don't have a comparison, then how can an investor do a good evaluation? There's also a lot of tension. Let's say the big energy companies were very worried about the negative impact. And the interesting about the energy companies is they need to show that they can have positive effects also, and they can be increasing their positive environmental efforts, trying to have cleaner energy, trying to find ways to improve their efficiencies. And they can be some of the most important players because they're the ones who are causing the most problems. They're the ones who are causing the biggest carbon emissions. They're the ones we need to be talking to in a positive way, as opposed to a punitive way, because you want them to cooperate and see the benefits they can get out of a positive ESG model, as opposed to being the ones lobbying against it. So I think the global trends are going to be the ability of countries to work together with their big energy companies, together to come to strategies and try to come up with reporting that is more standardized and resist the feeling that everybody likes to come up with their own standards, which just makes comparisons extremely difficult.
Right. My next question for Sarah, and perhaps Janet as well, are you seeing from your clients certain demands within, for the firm itself, in terms of your own ESG program? Because as professional, are we expected to do other things beyond charitable giving, volunteering, recycling? Is there any expectation from your clients, pushing for ESG on the law firm itself?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's quite stark in the last 18 months in particular. Whenever we are responding to a request for proposal, we are always being asked now to articulate our own position, policies, strategies, initiatives around ESG, around climate change in particular, in relation to human rights. And to me, it really reflects what we're seeing in investment markets when we're seeing an increased level of interrogation, sophistication and specificity in the way that asset owners will look to appoint asset managers to invest on their behalf, for example. So very, very much so. It's not sufficient anymore to say, oh yeah, we recycle our paper, therefore we're good at ESG. Clients are now themselves very sophisticated consumers and have their own stakeholders and reporting mechanisms that they in turn are beholden to. And so they need to make sure that across their entire supply chain, including their law firms, that everyone is rowing in the same direction.
I would say that our international clients, that's true. For the local clients, not so much, really not so much. But one place it is coming through the most, I would say, is diversity, which is part of ESG. It's part of the social because it's how we treat our workers. And there's a lot more interest that the firm has diversity in its workplace. And that's something that our firm has put a particular emphasis on.
Right. So does the client actually ask very, direct questions on your diversity and inclusion program?
Well, look, the international clients, when you're doing a request, often have extremely specific questions, many of which we cannot answer. This is a typical US client thing where you get this request and no, we do not keep track of people's sexual preferences. We just do not consider that's an invasion of privacy. We cannot tell you that, whatever. But so some of these things we can answer, some we can't. Also because we're in Israel, the question of African American representation would be a little bit different. So it's all a bit different. I do wonder if in the future we'll have clients that will want to will insist on us pushing back on business travel. Stop traveling so much. Maybe they won't want to foot the bill for people to travel over and attend every one of their board meetings 4 times a year, 6 times a year in other jurisdictions. Maybe it's just really not worth doing that because they saw that during this pandemic, everything was fine when the lawyers and everybody else wasn't all traveling to these places. So that could be something, but again, we don't know if that will happen yet.
Right. As you can tell, such expectations have not come to this part of the world. Something still very foreign to us in Singapore. I think we have a question from the participants. As a corporate practice, which are the areas where clients require specific legal advice on the ESG front? Sarah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, all of it. I mean, I suppose ESG, if you put to one side specific regulatory requirements, like, for example, if you have operations in the UK or Australia, there are specific modern slavery, due diligence and disclosure requirements. Putting those to one side, increasingly clients do understand that environmental issues, the way we treat our employees, the way we interact with the community actually does have financial consequences. So if you think about that in the context of a corporate practice, where do our clients need advice? They need it in mergers and acquisitions, for example. They need it when they are preparing any kind of disclosure document to the market, whether it is an annual report or whether it's a prospectus or other form of information memoranda. They need assistance when they're navigating issues in relation to investor relations and the questions that they're getting at AGMs. They need assistance with insurance, given that increasingly we're seeing both insurers and reinsurers withdraw coverage in high emitting areas, and also financial lines of coverage in addition to the general property insurance. Boards need assistance in understanding, well, what does due care and diligence look like in relation to this issue? Because 2 years ago, it was fine not to consider it, and now we have a legal obligation. So, what do we need to do? Right across the spectrum of a corporate practice now, we're seeing a need for legal services that have regard to these issues. Sometimes it's a matter of capacity building with the clients themselves. Sometimes we're brought in by the heads of ESG or heads of sustainability to actually explain to the board and to the executive why this is now a financial risk issue rather than a touchy-feely soft issue that can just be dealt with in the public relations department. Sometimes we're brought in because boards and executives now understand that it is an issue that they need to think about, but they don't know what that then requires them to do. And in other cases, we're brought in to help deploy specialist climate risk due diligence modules, particularly in an M&A or disclosure context. So the need of the particular client differs, but it is almost universal now across our corporate practice that it is relevant.
In my jurisdiction, maybe it's less sophisticated. So there is questions coming out about ESG, but in reality, because we don't have mandatory rules right now, the main areas of interest are really just building on things that are already in the practice, which is the environmental department, which is always advising its clients. And we now have a new chemicals database. For anyone who's using chemicals will have to be registered. There's constantly improving environmental laws and reporting requirements going on. That's always been the case. So they always need advice on that. Corporate governance, especially for public companies, obviously they always need advice on how they conduct themselves and what disclosure obligations they have and what are the duties of directors and what happens when there's a conflict of interest or special approvals are needed with related parties, et cetera. That's always been the case. We don't have anything new on that now, but it's a continued awareness. Also, as we start having more shareholder activism in our country, we have to have a lot more strategies in place for boards to deal with that. And the last one, of course, is the social, where the big emphasis is actually on the employment laws. Israel is a very pro-employee regime. We have labor courts that tend to be very pro-employee and pretty negative employer. So that practice and those governments and those needs have always been in place and they continue.
Okay, just want to see if there's any more questions. That doesn't look like it. If there are no further questions, I just want to leave you all with the words of a 17-year-old. The biggest danger is not inaction, she said. The real danger is when politicians and CEOs are making it look like real action is happening, when in fact almost nothing is being done apart from clever accounting and creative PR. That's Greta Thunberg. So with that, can we just please join me in a round of applause for Janet and Sarah. Thank you both. It was very educational, and I'm sure the members, especially the Asia members here, definitely benefited from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
With that, I will sign off now. Till next time. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.